The prominent figure I'm referring to is from an article titled "The Worst of the Worst," written by Radden Keefe and published on September 14, 2015, in The New Yorker. It's about a lawyer who defended Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, the Boston bombing suspect, and the story of his trial. The narrative begins on a cold winter day in early March. The streets were still full of piles of snow accumulated after several days of continuous blizzards. Judy Clarke, a 63-year-old woman, turned to the jury, stating that they had met under the most heartbreaking circumstances. That day in court, Clarke wore a dark pantsuit with a blue and purple scarf, an accessory she typically didn't wear. It was the trial of Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, accused of the Boston Marathon bombing. 2 years prior, Dzhokhar Tsarnaev and his older brother, Tamerlan Tsarnaev, detonated 2 homemade bombs near the Boston Marathon finish line, killing 3 people and injuring 264. Afterward, they carjacked a vehicle, leading to a lengthy pursuit and shootout with police, which resulted in the death of a police officer. Dzhokhar, then 19, accidentally ran over and killed Tamerlan, 26, while fleeing. Dzhokhar was found wounded and weak in a boat, having lost a lot of blood. He was taken to the hospital, and while he was there, authorities contacted Clarke, asking if she would represent him. She accepted the case. Clarke is considered the best defense attorney for death row inmates in the United States. The American capital punishment system is highly prone to error. Many innocent people are sent to death row, and many are later found to have been innocent. However, Clarke's fame isn't solely about handling such cases. Her specialty lies in representing the worst of the worst: terrorists, torturers, child abusers, individuals whose crimes are so horrific that even death penalty opponents might make an exception and say, "No, even though we oppose the death penalty, this one must die." Dzhokhar Tsarnaev fits this description. He is unequivocally guilty. There's a video widely circulated showing him placing a backpack containing a bomb behind a young boy, leaving it, and walking away. In 2014, a government representative who had openly stated his opposition to the death penalty declared that the level of fear and terror generated by this case was so immense that the government was seeking the death penalty for the defendant. Clarke's usual approach in these cases is to transform the defendant from an incomprehensible monster into one of us. This aligns with her personal philosophy that people are not born evil. She states, "In examining a case, our effort is to understand what causes someone who was not born evil to commit such an act of wickedness at a certain moment under specific circumstances." She adds, "As a lawyer throughout these cases, I try to see what causes someone to commit such a crime." Most of Clarke's successes have come from pretrial matters. The defendant accepts a plea in exchange for cooperation. For instance, someone who bombed an abortion clinic confessed to his crime and, in exchange for disclosing the location of a bomb near a residential area, received a life sentence without going to trial. When Clarke took on Dzhokhar's case, she proposed a plea bargain. He would admit guilt, apologize, and receive a life sentence without a trial. State authorities refused. She then attempted to move the trial out of Boston, arguing that any jury selected in Boston, the city where the bombing occurred, would be highly prejudiced against the defendant. The judge denied this request as well. Now, with this introduction and background, let's return to where we started the story. In the courtroom, Clarke began the first session by addressing the jury, saying, "We have met under the most tragic circumstances. Over the next few weeks, we will face a chain of bitter and sad events resulting from the foolish actions of 2 deeply misguided brothers." Naturally, she chose her words very carefully. Clarke's demeanor with the jury is always very warm, friendly, and approachable. She continued by stating, "Our disagreement about what happened is negligible." This effectively acknowledged her client's guilt. As she spoke, each juror had a monitor in front of them, allowing them to see documents displayed by either the prosecution or the defense. While she spoke, photos of Dzhokhar's childhood were shown on the monitor. A young boy with dark eyes and straight hair sitting next to a much older brother. "This boy was led here to detonate this bomb with his brother," she stated. As Clarke used her familiar technique of showing before and after photos, the jurors looked behind her where Jokar sat in a somewhat nonchalant manner, wearing a sport coat over an open-collared shirt, a style considered perhaps a bit too casual for a murder trial. He appeared so unconcerned. The jurors observed him. Clarke said, "My greatest wish today is for you to keep your minds and hearts open." Among her colleagues, Clarke is known for her humanitarianism, generosity, and exemplary commitment to her clients. She rarely gives interviews, but once, during a university speech, she said, "My clients forced me to change the definition of winning. For me, life imprisonment means winning." She added, "I am indebted to my clients who taught me the fragility and vulnerability of the human race." In court, she fights fiercely. She once said, "I generally love a fight." While her behavior isn't showy like many of her peers, it is part of the courtroom dynamic whenever necessary. For example, in 2003, a former intelligence officer was accused of killing his wife. Clarke called his 12-year-old daughter as a witness. The daughter turned to the jury and said, "My dad is everything to me." The judge warned Clarke that the girl was not allowed to address her father in court, but Clarke defied him and told the girl, "If you have anything to say to your dad, say it." The girl replied, "Daddy, I love you." This was enough to sway the jury, and they voted against the death penalty. Clarke personally opposes the death penalty. She states, "It is not befitting a civilized society to have legalized murder. However, her fascination with these cases isn't solely due to her opposition to capital punishment. It seems she's searching for a key to understand what makes a human being commit such acts. That's why she has repeatedly told juries in court, let's not focus on who and how, but rather on why and how it came to be." In her personal life, Clarke married her college boyfriend, who also later became a lawyer. When she started working at a syndicate after university, the total number of female criminal lawyers in the state was fewer than the fingers on one hand. She tirelessly worked for undocumented immigrants, drug dealers, and other individuals who committed federal crimes but couldn't afford private attorneys. She quickly became the head of the office. When she became director, she tripled the budget and doubled the number of lawyers. She also required every lawyer she hired to commit to working at least 60 hours. A prosecutor, O.J. Simpson's prosecutor, invited her to work on the Susan Smith case. Susan Smith was accused of putting her 2 young children in the backseat of her car, abandoning the car, and letting it roll into a lake, drowning the children. Clarke told the prosecutor, "I've never worked on a death penalty case." He replied, "It doesn't matter. I want you, not your experience." In this case, we see for the first time techniques that would later become Clarke's signature style. She turned to the jury and said, "I don't want to downplay what she did or make excuses or justify it, but you must look not only at that horrific event, but also at the entirety of the defendant's life that led to that moment and understand it." She explained that Smith had been abused by her stepfather as a child, had 2 failed suicide attempts, and even when she was near the lake, she wanted to kill herself and the children. However, at the last moment, the instinct for survival made her save herself, and by then, it was too late to save the children. The climax of this trial was when Susan's stepfather was called as a witness. He confessed to abusing her as a child. Clarke turned to Susan and said, "In this tragedy, you are not the only one to blame." Ultimately, Susan was not executed. A death penalty trial has 2 main parts. One part is about guilt, where the jury decides whether the defendant is guilty or not. The other part is about sentencing, where they decide what the punishment should be. Although Clarke effectively conceded the defendant's guilt in her opening statement, the prosecution team called witness after witness, victims, families of those who died, explaining their losses. People in wheelchairs came, people with prosthetic legs came, and before and after photos were shown. It was very impactful. After each witness testified, Clarke would quietly say, "No questions." She could have, for example, tried to find inconsistencies in their testimonies, but it would have been futile and might even have backfired. In this trial, She was very careful with her movements and their impact on the jury and the victims. On the other hand, she also tried very hard to establish a close relationship with her client. Although Dzhokhar sat in a slumped posture, some even claimed he was smirking in court. Later, his lawyers brought medical records showing that some of his facial nerves and features had been damaged by police gunfire. One of the injured victims who testified was a broad-shouldered man. He had undergone 70 surgeries. He had lost one leg and might lose the other. He was in a wheelchair. He detailed each of his injuries. His demeanor was such that it seemed he wanted to jump up and grab Dzhokhar and strangle him right there in court, but Tsarnaev never looked at him. Throughout the trial, Clarke sat to Dzhokhar's left, and another female colleague sat to his right, so he was always surrounded by two women. Every now and then, they would exchange a joke with him, or offer a comforting touch or pat on his back, both to show that he wasn't an outcast, not a leper, that he could be shown affection, and also for his own morale, given that during his detention, he wasn't allowed physical contact with any visitors. The prosecution team argued that this was an act of terrorism and that Tsarnaev was a jihadi who, influenced by radical Islamic teachings, planned to kill American citizens. They also found files attributed to Al-Qaeda on Dzhokhar's laptop, one of which explained how to make a bomb in the kitchen. In their home, remnants of explosive materials were discovered. The moment he was in the boat, he had written things on its interior walls that the prosecution wanted to cut out and bring into court. The defense lawyers objected, saying they had to bring the whole boat. Eventually, the judge, jury, prosecution, and defense lawyers all boarded a bus one day, went to see the boat up close. What he had written on the boat? There are bloodstains, bullet holes. The writing itself is intermittently missing due to bullet holes. But the content is, "Blessed be Tamerlan, he became a martyr. The American government kills innocent people. Throughout the world, Muslims are one body. I don't like killing innocent people either, but sometimes it is permissible." But despite all the efforts of the government and the prosecution team, Tsarnaev seemed less like a jihadi and more like a rebellious teenager. His lifestyle also indicated that he was not an ascetic or devout person at all. In college, he was known for being a drug dealer. His relationships with his friends also didn't resemble those of an Islamic fundamentalist. In death penalty cases, a significant amount of investigative work is required. They delve into the defendant's family history and mental state. Clarke compiles a social history for each client, a comprehensive biography covering decades of family background, including interviews with relatives, teachers, and neighbors. Any sign of mental illness or instability in the defendant is included. Her main premise is that the defendant is himself a victim of mental illness and environmental circumstances, and that this is why he was able to commit such a crime. Clarke says, "All of my clients who were condemned to death had suffered terrible psychological traumas. Many of them had their cognitive systems so severely damaged that their very humanity was called into question." The core of her argument is that none of us want to be judged or defined by the worst day, hour, or moment of our lives. This claim, even if we oppose the death penalty for any reason, is a strange one. Clarke genuinely believes it. If we cannot judge someone who kills a child for their actions, then can anyone be judged at all? Beyond this philosophical question, Clarke's actions also faced a more practical and tangible question. Wouldn't it be better for a skilled and capable lawyer like Clarke to spend her time defending innocent people instead of criminals whose guilt is clear and evident? The answer to this question might be yes, but innocent people's cases mostly go to state courts, and there isn't sufficient budget for comprehensive and detailed investigative and expert work. It's in cases like the Boston bombing case that there's ample funding for extensive investigations. However, even with financial resources, she faced another limitation: the confidentiality of documents. The government claimed that Tsarnaev still posed a threat to national security, arguing he might return to incite others or send messages to potential sympathizers he might have outside. They stated that the defendant could not communicate with anyone outside his legal team or family, and more importantly, They classified many of the case-related documents and evidence as confidential. The judge also provided detailed reasons why the case should be kept confidential. However, those very reasons were also classified as confidential and not disclosed. Many experts said that the level of classification in this case was extremely high, and that for someone who is the sole survivor of a two-person terrorist group, the extent of the threat they considered was exaggerated. On April 8th, the jury found him guilty on all counts during the guilt phase. The defense lawyers called only 4 witnesses, all of whom were technical experts. They explained that all fingerprints on the bomb-making materials belonged to Tamerlan. When Tamerlan was buying the materials, Dzhokhar was never with him. He was always in another city. The strong content found on his computer related to radical Islam was only a small part of a vast amount of material he had downloaded, and it didn't indicate that he spent most of his time on the internet. He spent more time on Facebook and other activities. Some tweets that the government presented in court as signs of his fundamentalism were lyrics from rap songs, and some were from comedy series. The man whose car was stolen said that Tamerlan constantly bragged about the marathon bombing, and how they killed a police officer and blew up that place. But Dzhokhar wasn't interested in those things. He only asked me if he could stream music from his iPhone to my car stereo. Their entire effort was to argue, Tamerlan was the mastermind. He was the one involved, not this one. However, during the sentencing phase, the lawyers called over 40 witnesses. They explained that Dzhokhar and his parents came to America from Chechnya in 2002, seeking political asylum. His sisters and Tamerlan came later. They are effectively considered refugees from the Chechen-Russian War. Both parents were ambitious but paid little attention to their living conditions. They had a very small apartment. His sisters married, had children, and both later divorced with children. They then returned to the same small apartment. Tamerlan pursued boxing but was unsuccessful. He then tried various other jobs, also without success. He also married, had children, and returned to the same small apartment. Around 2010, Tamerlan and his mother, living in these difficult conditions, gradually became drawn to Islam. Interestingly, the Islam they embraced wasn't the moderate Islam common in the Caucasus, in Chechnya. It was a Salafist Islam rooted more in the internet, which we are seeing more evidence of in recent years. At that time, Tamerlan's situation was such that his wife worked, and he was mostly at home all day. He spent his days watching videos about the plights of Muslims worldwide, the injustices against Muslims here and there. He even traveled to Dagestan in 2012 for jihad, but investigations showed that he mainly spent his time there debating politics in cafes. The portrait drawn by the defense lawyers of Dzhokhar Tsarnaev is that of a child who was the family's darling, who practically worshipped his older brother. He had become more Americanized than the rest of his family members. He did well in school, was captain of the regional wrestling team. When he went to college, his family fell apart. His parents divorced, and eventually both returned separately to the Caucasus. Tamerlan gradually became more radicalized. That's when he started wearing traditional Islamic attire, and the family situation gradually worsened. Neither the government nor the prosecution team ever claimed that the two brothers were part of a larger group. Tamerlan, in Clarke's words, had radicalized himself through the internet, and the main question for the lawyers was whether this was also true for Dzhokhar. The photos the lawyers showed of Dzhokhar's and his friend's room in college and the testimonies his friends gave showed the kind of life he had there. After their classes, they mostly smoked weed, played video games. Their room had a big TV and lots of boxes of chips and snacks scattered around. Unlike Tamerlan, who would talk about imperialism and the injustices against Muslims whenever he found an open ear, Dzhokhar never engaged in political discussions, so much so that many of his friends didn't even know he was Muslim. Even the prosecutors claim that he led a double life didn't seem very logical after listening to these testimonies and looking at the photos. Someone else also testified that in Chechen culture, the older brother plays a very central and dominant role, and the younger brother must practically obey him without question. Another interesting testimony came from one of his teachers, whose husband was also his football coach. She said, "He's very young, very impressionable, he does whatever the coach tells him. This made their defense strategy clear. Tamerlan was in charge, and Dzhokhar obeyed him due to social and personal reasons. In the state where Boston is located, the death penalty has been abolished for 30 years. But under U.S. federal law, the central government can still seek the death penalty, contrary to the state government's opinion. Part of the lawyer's work in this case was to question the death penalty in general. As she had argued in previous cases, Clarke believed that society ultimately needs to reach a point where killing is wrong and immoral, whether done by an individual or the state. One of Clarke's colleague lawyers explained the difference between the two scenarios of life imprisonment and execution to the jury. He showed several photos of Clarke's previous clients who had received life sentences. They live in an empty prison in the middle of a snow-covered desert, very isolated, without even communicating with other prisoners. On the other hand, he argued, for someone who receives a death sentence, the process of repeated appeals can last for decades, and each time they appeal, it receives media coverage that will prolong the pain and suffering of the survivors and victims. They might even become a martyr-like figure. If you want him to suffer and face the consequences of his actions every moment and every day, give him life imprisonment.